Thanks for taking time to come here. It's, for me, an interesting topic. I guess it's fair to say that issues of science and democracy have been with me for quite a long time, but I'm not the only person in the room that's true for. So Jerry Ravetz and Silvio Funtowicz are writing down notes that I think they're going to ask me questions at the end of this. And they're a pretty intimidating pair of people, so don't be fooled by the fact that they look nice. But I've known them both for quite a long time, and they're not the only scholars in the room who've worked on these things. So it's very nice to have the chance to talk about this. Citizen science, I will say more about, but it's probably fair to say that it's a topic that I've given a reasonable amount of thought to. I should probably say that 20 years ago, I published a book with the title Citizen Science in it, not necessarily meaning the same thing, but it does mean, slightly to my surprise, that sometimes I will be seen as someone who was one of the founders of citizen science. And I'm not saying this to make myself sound important, but I hope you can hear the kind of slightly ambiguous feeling that you do something, you pick a title for a book, and then 20 years later, there's a whole movement working in that area, but not necessarily the same meaning of citizen science that I had in mind 20 years ago. So I think one of the things that drew me to this topic, I wanted to say that right at the beginning, was me also thinking, well, how do I engage with something called citizen science? And what's the relationship, you can see it in the title, between that and this other concept that I've often talked about in different ways, usually rather vaguely, I have to say, scientific citizenship. They sound like the same thing. So should we see the phenomenon of citizen science, and I'll say more about that in a second, is basically meaning the same thing, or what's the relationship between the two? So the question mark at the end isn't a question mark to you, it's basically a question mark to myself, because I started to write something down thinking, well, how do I make sense of that? And the image I keep coming back to, I like this image very much of oil and water, is of two things which to me aren't neatly separated. What is citizen science, as I'll go on to say, is certainly open to discussion. There are many different ideas about citizen science. I'll talk about that in just a few seconds. But equally, you can see scientific citizenship, is swirling around at the same time too. So this isn't about a meeting point of two fixed entities, which we're quite clear about. It's more some kind of interchange. And I suppose one of the things I like about this oil and water picture is the idea of kind of fragmentation, but I also like the idea of flow, because I think like with mixing oil and water, it's something which requires energy. And I think that's also true of citizen science and scientific citizenship. Certainly, one thing we can say, and I've already given you something kind of autobiographical about my take on citizen science, is that we've heard a lot in the last few years in particular about the notion of citizen science. There are various routes, I should say, to the concept of citizen science. Probably, I mean, people ask me, and honestly, I don't remember, back in '95 when I was publishing that book, was I aware of a citizen science movement at the time? I don't know, because it's hard to think back, but I do know that certainly from the early '90s, in areas like ornithology, bird watching, you had movements of people called citizen science, and one of those was in Ithaca at Cornell University. So probably when you're looking for the founding of something called citizen science, that would be a very good place to start. I know historically the term can be traced back, but usually the idea of amateur bird watchers, of people who've got a deep knowledge about an area, like many ornithologists do, who are working alongside scientists. Probably that's the most strong and most typical idea of citizen science. I'll come back to that in a second. So we've got this remarkable growth. I certainly don't list all of the uses and all the ways in which this comes up. But you can see, for example, if you look at the top right here, this thing called Zooniverse. real science online, a large range of activities, often based on some kind of crowdsourcing. The idea, astronomy, you can see the Milky Way project there, or Galaxy Zoo, using the kind of large numbers of people, eyes, looking for phenomena, accessing a huge variety of computers, to bring in people who are not traditionally seen as science into the activity, in this case of astronomy. In France, Science Citoyenne, the European Citizen Science Association, relatively recently established. The EEA, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the European Environment Agency. They've certainly, to my knowledge, been talking about citizen science for quite some time now and developing it as part of their activities. And because I'm based in Copenhagen, as is the EEA, probably that's when I first started to think about citizen science in this way, because I could hear people at the European Environment Agency referencing the term. It just started to keep coming up. And I thought, that's interesting. In this presentation, I'm going to focus particularly on Citizen Science 2015, which was a meeting of the US-based Citizen Science Association. Very large meeting. Angela was there. So she can point it out when my recollection. Was anyone else at that meeting? Just Angela? But Angela was there. So she can tell you about her thoughts on this. I was there, and I was interested just to see what was going on. In San Jose, in the Citizen Science Association meeting, you had 600 plus very enthusiastic North Americans, and that is pretty damn enthusiastic when you've got people in California being enthusiastic. They are really enthusiastic. So there was a lot of buzz around, a lot of excited, isn't that right, Angela, weren't they excited? Angela was also excited. But just not less noisily. So a lot of people there, a sense of we're doing something new. I don't think this was the first meeting of the American Citizen Science Association. That goes back a little bit. But there was a very strong sense of we're now basically founding an institution. A new journal was also being established at that point. The editorial board was being put together. Big keynotes. It was just before the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS meeting, so that obviously added to it also. And what struck me, and this is really my attempt to kind of get into the meaning of citizen science, was the way in which the terminology of citizen science is being used. Because I was very interested to see, well, what are they talking about when they talk about citizen science? And I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but I just wanted to talk about the two keynotes that were given, one towards the beginning, which was this one by Chris Filardi, and one towards the end, which I'll come to in a second. Because for me, those two keynotes, and remember, there was rather more people in the audience here. This was a 600 plus people in the audience. But those two keynotes gave me a pretty good feeling of the kind of spread of things which go under the citizen science label. It's not one activity, it's many different kinds of things. So let me talk about this one first of all. So Chris Filardi, who is an evolutionary biologist, you can see him there in what seems to be his natural habitat. He looks rather at home there. He basically works in the Pacific, in island populations, doing what evolutionary biologists do, mapping out the area, taking close observations of changing animal behavior and animal life in particular. He's the director of Pacific programs at the American Museum of Natural History. When Chris Filardi spoke, well, you see his title here. This is his title, A Place in the World, Science, Society, and Reframing the Questions We Ask. What you got from Filardi when he talked about citizen science was very much about a participatory mode of research. Reframing the questions we ask was a very important part of Chris's presentation. He talked about other ways of knowing. He talked a lot about his experience as a scientist of working, you could imagine, in these rather intense communities, working very closely with the indigenous people on the Pacific Islands, and seeing what he was doing. His version of citizen science was very much about a meeting point between his training as a formal scientist and the local people in that community and the kind of questions that they were asking. So he used a very interesting phrase at one point in his presentation. As you can probably hear, I was very entranced by his very powerful presentation. It was very interesting to me. But at one point he talked about the community he was working with on the island, picking me up and putting me inside their questioning community. That's the expression. They picked him up and they put him inside their questioning community. And he told stories. Actually, he told a lot of really interesting stories about, for example, being on the island and he had access, you could imagine, to some kind of hut or some area where his equipment was stored. And every morning, the daughter of the local chief would bring him, rather ceremoniously, the key to the hut so he could get access to it. And that worked very smoothly. And then after a few months, he was talking to the chief, and the chief said, you know, many times I thought about throwing this key away into the jungle because I really didn't know if I wanted you here at all, because you were disturbing the community so much. But I decided to trust you. I decided to trust you. And that's why the key was coming to him every day. You can see how very close up and personal and how much Chris Filardi was thinking about this. He talked also about the work in terms of mapping the island in terms of habitat. Perhaps many of you know more about this kind of work than I do. And being warned again by the local chief that certain parts of the island were sacred because certain animals which science wouldn't normally acknowledge, were living in that island. So would it be possible not to disturb that area? And Chris Filardi said, of course I wouldn't disturb the area. You know, we have to work together. So no, I won't touch that area, even though Filardi said probably that was one of the most interesting areas to visit because it was so totally undisturbed. But he saw it as a relationship. If the local people thought an area was sacred or important, he should respect that. That was his take on what citizen science should be about, very much about that kind of meeting point. Yes. Towards the end of the conference, there was a second keynote. And now we have a very different idea of citizen science. Well, I'm going to stress it as if it's different, but I suppose one of the interesting things to think about is what are the common strands between these things which seem to be very different. This is Amy Robinson, and her talk was entitled iWire. I'll explain what that is. Why do gamers enjoy mapping the brain? So iWire, you can see on the right, or you can Google it and you'll find out a lot more than I'll take time to explain, is basically about crowdsourcing. It's a gamification. I learned that new word, gamification, turning something into a game. And currently, well, when she spoke, which was back in February, she said about 160,000 people are playing on iWire, 160,000 people. And it's an interesting mix of science and what you might call crowdsourcing, I suppose. It involves basically mapping, that's what you see on the right, synaptic connections in the brain. So for various reasons, which I won't go into, mapping 3D cellular structures is a rather complicated activity. By turning it into a game, so you see on the left yesterday and on the right today, people can compete to see who can put these 3D structures into place as fast as possible. So you get points, basically, for doing this, and you compete with other gamers, just like a standard computer game. There's no financial reward. The reward, and Amy Robinson stressed this very powerfully, was being in the gaming community, for being a high-status person in the gaming community. So she talked a lot about the importance of design. If you're going to draw people in, it's got to look great. And she was very Californian, and I won't do that thing about enthusiasm again, but she definitely was a very high-powered Californian entrepreneurial type, I would say. But this isn't about making money. But what she was trying to say was that here we have a way that citizen science can extend the power of science. You can take something which is scientifically very important, mapping the structures of the human brain, turn it into a game, and in that way get very large amounts of energy and input. Beautiful imagery, clear design, the idea of having campaign blitzes of people coming together and really, in a weekend, for example, focusing on the activity were really important. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that you've got two different approaches to citizen science here. They do have things in common. I mean, both of them are about the public extension of science, taking science into new areas. Faladi's example on Papua New Guinea, or Amy Robinson dealing with gamers. They're all about winning people over, you could say, to science who do not see themselves as currently part of science. There's something in there about the power of engagement, about the idea of participation, and about the societal significance of scientific research. I think both Faladi and Robinson were saying it's really valuable for people to have that kind of access. And of course, when both of them are speaking, they both have the idea that this isn't about getting paper qualifications, going down to your local university, studying for a bachelor's degree or a master's degree or whatever. Both of them have got the idea that we need to open up new ways of engaging with science. I guess that's the power of what's there. But of course, you could also say that there are profound differences. This is something which a guy called Muki Hackley has put together. I think I actually made it into a table based on his ideas. And you get the idea of a kind of level of participation running through these ideas. So this is Hackley's version of what goes on in that kind of situation. You've got the crowd sourcing as level 1, citizens as sensors, distributed intelligence at level 2, citizens as basic interpreters, level 3, participation, and level 4, collaboration. So if you look at it in terms of the two presentations I've given, I guess the first presentation from Chris Faladi is somewhere between collaborative science and participation, and the one from Amy Robinson is more like using citizens as sensors or basic interpreters. But these categorizations tell you something, and I guess it's easy to see how activities often reside around levels 1 and level 2 on this kind of basis. But it's a particular presentation. This presentation is putting science and knowledge at its core. This is citizen science seen from the perspective of scientific organizations, really. You could do it differently. You could talk about the institutional location of citizen science, or you could do it in terms of whether it's state-led or centrally organized, or whether it's DIY type citizen science, or whether something which is organized in that kind of way. But what seems to be the case, I guess what all of these citizen science activities have in common, this is a quote from my paper, is they seem to involve some point, some meeting point between the thing that we usually refer to as public engagement or public participation in science and actual knowledge production, or to put that in fancier terms, societal context and epistemology meet. Citizen science seems to be drawing attention to the importance of those two things. We tend to put them in separate boxes. We tend to think that public engagement is a kind of political activity, and we can defend that in various ways. Or we think in terms of issues of knowledge and expertise, getting the best information, the best insights we possibly can. Citizen science, I guess, even at the kind of level of citizens as sensors, although this is debatable, has the element of bringing these two things together. And I stress this point about public participation and knowledge production, because often when people talk about citizen science, and I've seen this happen very often now, the first move they make is actually to separate those two things, to say it's extremely important that we keep those two animals apart. The political animal and the knowledge animal, we should separate them. We should think about citizen science either as one or the other. I think I strongly disagree with that. It seems to me that the interesting part particularly is where those two things start to come together. You can kind of see it in Faladi's example with the Pacific Islanders probably more easily than you can with Amy Robinson's. But when he was saying that certain parts of the island were seen to be sacred and therefore he as a scientist ought to respect that, you can see these things connecting. Another scientist might say, but that's nonsense. But for him, if you take these two things as connecting, there's a pretty good rationale for why you would do it in that sort of way. The other thing I want to say about these kind of categorizations, if I go back to that for a second, is that they're rather static. I mean, they seem to assume, and it's inevitable, of course, it's not a criticism of Hakluyt directly, that when things are in one category, they're going to stay in that category. So one of the interesting things to me about that meeting point is the movement that can happen through citizen science engagement. Even if something starts out as gamification, to use the Robinson example, where would that lead? I mean, is it something that starts as gamification, to use that word, and stays there? Or is it something where perhaps people getting involved with iWire might start to say, well, what's going on when Silicon Valley companies and university laboratories are collaborating quite so tightly? I should think about the politics of iWire. Or in the case of Filati, well, actually, it could go the opposite way. It could be that what starts off as a meeting point between citizens and scientists ends up as the islanders being given some cash by the American Museum of Natural History to go out and find this particular bunch of birds. And in a way, it's gone from being Filati's more ambitious idea into something which looks very much like a standard model of science. So these movements seem to be important. And why do I stress that? Well, I stress it because I guess one of my most formative experience in this area, now I'm going to go back a long, long way. Jerry might remember this back in the 1970s, when there were things called work hazards groups. I spent my time, BizRiz, I'm thinking about, the British Society for Social Responsibility of Science had work hazards groups. And what was interesting there wasn't the question that came to us, because typically it would be someone, because I was based in Manchester, it would be someone working in the asbestos industry. And often you would get your post and you'd get this horrible package of stuff, and there'd be a note saying, oh, and now you're covered in it. We think this might cause cancer, but could you please identify what it is? Well, thank you very much. But it wasn't where it started, with a sort of simple inquiry about, will this cause cancer or not? It's where the conversation led to. That was the most interesting part. So that device of having a kind of work hazards group led to the possibility of all kinds of questions developing from what looked like a simple scientific question. So one of the things I'm trying to point to in citizen science is that it's not just about what category it fits into, it's what is around that category and what are the possibilities for people to use it to learn more or to ask deeper questions. It seems to me that that requires institutions to be in a position to respond to citizens asking questions, otherwise it can't go anywhere. But it also means that we need some kind of model of citizenship which involves people being enabled in terms of asking those questions. If you put it slightly differently, you could say that the model of Robinson's about the kind of society we live in, with campaign blitzes and gamification and a certain relationship to science and technology, is very, very different to that presented by Filati. But each of them have the capacity, I would suggest, arguably, to open up to more. What then about scientific citizenship? That was the citizen science part of my talk. But where does that fit in? Well, this again, I mean, even more than citizen science, I would argue, is an area of long discussion on what, of course, in its essence, what ought to be the relationship between science and wider ideas of citizenship. In this book by Melissa Leach, Ian Schoons, and Brian Wynn, all good STS colleagues, they argue that the need to clarify our understanding of the complex interfaces between science and citizenship is now more pertinent than ever. I agree, it's just that could be said at any point in history, and the same point would also be true. So this issue, precisely about the intermingling of science and citizenship, is by no means new, but that doesn't mean that it's not still pertinent. Now, when you talk about scientific citizenship in this way, in terms of the elements here about the interfaces and intersections between science and citizenship, you get to a rather different place. I mean, the citizen science examples I've used have both been extremely specific, whether it's evolutionary biology on Papua New Guinea or whether it's gamification. There's something very tangible. As soon as you move into the world of scientific citizenship, a whole set of questions start to come at you from all sorts of directions. I'm sure you'll recognize most of the pictures here, and you'll probably be able to get the connection, whether it's anti-GM crop pickers, issues about climate change. This, of course, is COP15. There's the Danish Prime Minister, and now again the Danish Prime Minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, looking a little bit out of his depth, I have to say, in the middle of those discussions, BSc arguments about democracy. So I guess when I put that up, I'm saying, well, how can this thing called citizen science, this very specific issue of citizen science, how can that possibly address these kinds of questions? What could the connection be? That's basically the question I'm asking in this presentation. Well, before you start to answer that, I guess we need to unpack a little bit the idea of scientific citizenship and what that might involve. So let me have a go at doing that, and then I'll talk about the possible connection between the two, and then I'll finish. Yes, I'll finish in about 10 minutes or so. So for me, scientific citizenship is about opening up different futures. It seems in all of those areas of science and technology, particular models of the future are being devised. The European Spallation Source, that's what the picture is here, which isn't built yet, but you get the usual kind of artist's model that's in Malmö Lund in Sweden, is a good model, a kind of vision of the future. But the anti-GM crop pickers are also presenting a vision of the future. So the challenge with scientific citizenship is very often to say, how can we open up, as Andy Sterling would say, those different futures rather than simply narrowing them down? Institutions typically narrow, and citizenship typically opens up. Of course, scientific citizenship is about asking questions about the relationship between knowledge and democracy, an old issue, but nevertheless one that doesn't quite go away. Scientific citizenship also talks about the relationship between knowledge and power. Again, an old discussion. I mean, what does it mean that people have access perhaps neither to political power nor to the kind of knowledges which enable them to play a part in scientific discussions? Citizen science potentially could be a way of redressing that balance. Of course, it all depends what one means by what particular form of citizen science one has in mind. Scientific citizenship also, certainly for me, if you go back to those examples, sorry to keep going backwards and forwards there, a lot of this isn't caught by the usual model of citizenship. I mean, what it means to be a citizen in an area like climate change. I mean, the traditional models of parliamentary democracy are not designed to deal with a question like that. Again, arguably. So as Ulrich Beck argued, there's something about the way in which citizenship itself is changing in these kind of contexts. When the issues are global, national parliamentary systems seem to be rather peripheral. There's an interesting idea from Melissa Leach and Ian Schoons about citizenship as a kind of practiced engagement. In other words, it's not just about talking about things, but it's also about the ways in which you put into practice ideas. Again, one thing about citizen science is that it has that possibility. It may be a project on earthworms, or it may be something about bird watching. But either way, it's got the potential for a direct engagement with those issues, rather than simply a kind of intellectualizing. But I particularly wanted to throw in also ideas about justice. I think when these writers, Viswanathan or Frickham, talk about cognitive justice or epistemic justice, they're reminding us that citizenship at its heart is about justice, and something which, when we talk about areas of science like climate change or GM or BSE, ideas of justice quickly kind of get pushed out the room as if they're a little embarrassing in that situation. But citizenship potentially seems to me to bring them back in. So what then, as I move to the last part of my presentation, what can we say about this. It's obviously quite an agenda to go from these specific examples of citizen science to those sort of very large issues indeed. And I could say much more about them, and I know I've dealt with them extremely quickly. It seems like a huge agenda. But we could start to say, well, is citizen science an institution, an activity with the possibility of producing science in non-conventional ways? Does it have that potential? And could it play a larger role with regard to citizenship? Before I go into that, I should say there's nothing wrong, I suppose you could say, with a kind of citizen science which simply extends knowledge. I mean, that can be very useful in all sorts of occasions. I'm not arguing against that. I'm simply saying, for me, it's much more interesting if it has the potential, at least, to address issues of citizenship. So if we bring the citizen and the science into citizen science, I guess we have to ask ourselves two questions. And this is where I will end up. To what extent is citizen science facilitating the wider development of scientific citizenship? Can you see examples where that's happening? And of course, the second question is going to be about whether it has the capacity to do this. So let's deal with the first one, the issue about whether citizen science is facilitating. I think when you look at this kind of model, it's hard to resist the argument that most of the citizen science that's happening right now, to the extent it's happening at all, but it's a growing movement, as I said at the beginning, is more at the Amy Robinson side of things, the iWire side of things, than it is at the Chris Filati. It's much easier to think of examples where crowdsourcing is involved, using publics as sensors, for example, to track astronomy or changing patterns of wildlife, than it is to see participatory, or what Hackley calls extreme citizen science, which is more about a kind of co-production idiom. So it's really hard to resist that kind of conclusion. And again, just to stress, just because it's at level 1 doesn't mean that it's insignificant or unimportant. I guess, particularly because of that argument about the potential that comes out of these things. It could still be important even at level 1. So I'm not trying to diminish the importance of that. But nevertheless, it seems to be true that most of it is there. And of course, there are good reasons for that. It's not that scientists have not thought about it or that people are lazy. It's because it's very difficult within the institutions of science to incorporate much of these ideas. This is a report from 2013, and I'm not going to go through it. But I mention it here because one of the arguments made in this report, I'm one of the co-authors, I should quickly say, but it was chaired by Ulrike Felt from Vienna, was that in the way in which scientific career structures are made, even relatively modest forms of citizen engagement at the level of censors or basic interpreters are hard to squeeze in. The way in which global scientific careers are established typically is not about encouraging people to work at level 3 or level 4, if I stick to Hackley's terminology. It's very hard to build a scientific career by working in that kind of way. Actually, one of the things I found most interesting at the Citizen Science Association conference in San Diego was talking to some young researchers who'd been doing work with American farmers and basically coming to the conclusion that their whole training was to keep the farmers out of the discussion, because that could ruin the whole methodology if the farmers start to be involved in the activity. And then they talked very engagingly about coming to the conclusion that if they didn't work with the farmers, how on earth was the work they were doing going to be of any value whatsoever, because they realized the recommendations they were coming up with was simply impossible for the farmers to implement, because they couldn't buy seeds on the basis what scientifically was being argued. Chris Filati actually makes a similar point when he says that, how could you do environmental management on a Pacific island without working with the local community? It's simply impossible to see how that could be done. But despite that, there are powerful pressures. And I don't mean individual pressures, I'm not talking about some conspiracy, but within the structure of scientific careers, which, so to say, are training scientists to keep publics out. In that sense, even the most limited use of citizen science should be seen as quite radical. So it's hard on the first question of is it happening to say much more, well, if it's happening to a rather limited degree. And when it is happening, it certainly isn't about arguing some broader idea of citizenship. In that sense, someone like Chris Velarde, I think, is in the minority when it comes to this. But, you know, I'm cursed with this optimistic temperament. So I look at this, it's a major problem for me. But I look at this and want to say, and, you know, Silvio and Jerry are very rational people, so they can no doubt criticize me for this. But what's the potentiality that's there? Because there's something about the immediacy, about the engagement, about actually the excitement that people can develop around citizen science, which seems to me to be rather promising. Again, back in San Diego, one of the interesting things was just to walk around. They had a lot of booths and stalls where people were talking about their own citizen science project. I learned more about earthworms in 10 minutes than I knew my entire life. I had no idea earthworms were so interesting, but you had a group of people not trained as scientists telling you all sorts of really fascinating things about earthworms. I was totally impressed by it. And you come away thinking, but there's some energy, there's some potential there. It may not be dressed up in broader terms, but there's something there. So what can we say about the potential of citizen science? And I'm stressing potential rather than reality. Well, it does have the idea of distributed expertise. Some clever people talked about extended peer review some time ago. It has the idea of broadening out the idea of expertise in a way which crosses institutional boundaries. Any historian will say, but come on, that's always been a part of science and public relations. I mean, there's always been this phenomenon. And that, of course, is absolutely true. So it's not a new thing that it happens. But nevertheless, I think it is worthwhile. If people can feel enabled in some way, then that's already beneficial. There's something about the mix of citizen science. And I guess that's what I was getting from those stalls in San Diego, where people are talking about their activities. The way in which words like fun are used, and I know it's always easy to disparage that. Fun isn't serious. But in a way, the idea of mixing up fun and problem solving with ideas of expertise is already a radical thing. So this is not science for some kind of certification. Certainly the element of practiced engagement, to go back into that term. You can see in citizen science projects the idea that citizenship isn't something that we receive, it's something which involves practical, in this case, literally hands-on kind of activities. There's something about that which changes our ideas of citizenship. Justice, well, you don't hear many people talk about justice when they're talking about citizen science. That seems to be an awkward mix. But potentially, and now I'm stressing potentially, if you think of many communities of kind of being doubly disadvantaged in terms of poverty, but also in terms of access to knowledge structures, citizen science has the potential, and now you think of areas like the environmental justice movement, to deal in some way with that. The capacity for learning, well, that's an open question. I suppose that's the part I feel most critical about. If citizen science simply is an extension of science, as I've tried to say, it can be something with value, but the learning element would be rather restrained. I was involved quite a lot in science shops, again, back a long time ago, and it was always interesting to see how communities often had a very high level of demand for science shops, but scientists often simply couldn't see the purpose of doing that. I mean, they could sort of see how it could be an extension of their activity, but the idea that they might actually learn something from engagement exercises was something that passed them by. I think Chris Velarde would be an example of someone who said, yes, I did learn. You know, that thing about picking me up and putting me in their questioning community was also a way of saying I saw things. I simply saw things I didn't see without that. But that would be a particularly unusual example. So I'm going to finish by saying, well, how would you map out the potential of citizen science for scientific citizenship? And I'm not saying these are final, but I just wanted to throw out for discussion, and this is what Silvio and Jerry haven't seen because it's not in the written version of the paper. It seems to me that citizen science, if it's going to have this wider role, needs to be seen as a challenge or a disturbance or provocation to science. and not solely an extension of it. It's got to have that troubling thing. I think Chris Velarde obviously got that, the sense of, oh, there's a different way of looking at these things. You had to be, in a way, made uncomfortable about it before you could have that experience. Citizen science also, in some way, has to be about giving up control. I think that's very difficult for individual scientists because of what I was saying about the way in which scientific careers are established. But it can't always be defined by the scientific institutions who then go out to citizens. It's also got to have the potential to move the other way. Those sort of categorizations, the categorization I use from Hackley with the level 1, 2, 3, 4, is all about knowledge. But I guess the citizen bit of citizen science needs at least as much attention. Currently, people see it as a knowledge extension rather than thinking of it as a citizenship extension. So perhaps that bit needs to be brought into the picture. And as I've suggested at a number of points, for me, it's a way of questioning our ideas of citizenship. I mean, a lot of citizenship ideas are basically a turn-off to many people. Ideas of voting, younger people, and parliamentary elections, they often simply don't see the connection. So it could be something which actually makes you think about what citizenship means. I hope I've argued that epistemic justice is important. Institutional learning certainly needs to be addressed if we're going to find ways of getting two-way lessons from citizen science. And then finally, somehow this needs to be a meeting point. I mean, I think the exciting thing about the rise of citizen science associations and activities is that it becomes, perhaps it's the place where a set of old questions are being asked again. Perhaps the questions themselves are not new, but it at least provides the possibility of a meeting space. So in that way, I refuse to be entirely negative about citizen science, even if the examples have been rather restricted in character, because that seems to be a potentially important space. Finally, very finally, I argue, because when I first gave this talk, it was to a group of scientific institutions, that they themselves can't deliver this. It can't be simply a matter for scientific institutions alone. But positive change in that area may not be a bad place to start. So thank you for listening to me. I'll stop now. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we have been privileged to hear some very interesting presentation on citizen science and science citizenship, or whatever, technological citizenship and other terms. I think Alan Irwin did it in a very interesting way, looking at what are the ambiguities, contradictions, and potentials. So I just want to reflect and perhaps provide some other elements to something that it is quite important. It's good that, you know, Paul Simon had a song called Still Crazy After All These Years. And it's good to know that we are still crazy after all these years, and nothing of our, you know, level of critique and engagement has changed. You know, so that's very nice. So now, looking, it's interesting Hackley's table about how do you categorize citizens science. And he has this, if you look at Hackley, he calls it extreme citizen science. Okay? Now, I follow Hackley on his tweets, and most of the time, I don't find anything that it is extreme in what he does and he promotes. So I would do an interesting comparison between Hackley's distinctions and where do you put extreme in Shirley Arnstein's Ladder of Participation from 1969. So if you want the reference, of course. And you will see that if you compare extreme citizen science in the ladder of participation, which was a paper in 1969, I checked it now and then, it's quite low. It is quite low. And that's a good exercise to try to place or situate extreme citizen science in terms of participation and meanings of participation. Now, it's also interesting, and as I say, I'm taking just a few points because there is no time to develop all this, it's interesting when Alan started with the ornithologist or the botanist or the astronomer, where you have this, the amateur, the dilettante scientist, which goes back to the Victorian times, which was very common. The idea of, and it was very interesting in botany and things of that type, astronomy, things like that. And that was an important point in the transformation in what were called the political economy of science, with the idea of demarcation. From there, you started with the gentleman scientist, and then the professional scientist, and then the industrial scientist, and now the innovation entrepreneur. So that is something interesting, is because we are changing the demarcation between what is considered science and what is not science, then we have opened the door to the new type of amateur scientists. So amateur scientist perhaps doesn't go well with the professional scientist or the industrial scientist, but goes quite well with the innovation researcher, an entrepreneur. The last point, a couple more points, is remember, Alan, that when we started to work on the subject, and you mentioned about you're working in Manchester on asbestos, or you could say dioxin at that time. The point that for us was very important when in the early 1980s we started to talk about the extended peer communities and things like that, issues of quality, we had in mind one important case, which is paradigmatic, and that was the origin of what we can call popular epidemiology, and that was Louis Gibbs and the Love Canal story. I don't know if you know the Love Canal story, but it was quite interesting to follow. I don't have time to say, but Louis Gibbs, who was a housewife in this community of Love Canal, how she fought the whole administrative and scientific establishment in order to show that children were getting ill from a chemical heritage or chemical legacy. And what she did was something quite different from your standard citizen science of today, because she challenged the whole scientific establishment and also the way in which epidemiology was done through statistical techniques. And she also introduced an idea that unfortunately was not very well continued about how do you introduce precaution into your statistical and experimental methods. But I'm going to go. The last point I want to make today, and if you follow the scientific journals and the journals, mass media journals, international, you will see that there is a debate today between science and democracy. In the case of climate, it's quite clear. We have seen meetings of legal scholars which argue that if democracy is a burden in order to fulfill or develop or apply climate policies, then we should forget about democracy. And so what you have is that these two terms, science and citizen and democracy, are increasingly in conflict. And that goes back to the conflict between knowledge and power, and the conflict between knowledge, power, and justice, as Alan clearly said. I think this is a subject that it is going to be discussed more and more. And it is the result of what I will call the entropic or thermodynamic character of our democracies, and the substantial changes and contradiction of what we understand as science today. Well, that's what I comment. Thank you.
Right. Well, I've been introduced, and I've just to find out where I want. Okay, here we are. Yep. Well, first of all, of course, we see how Alan has been too modest, and only a person who created an early version of this concept of citizen science could give this really profound analysis of what it's all about. So I think we are really privileged to have Alan here at ISPRA shaping up what this whole thing that is going on is all about. Now, I could talk with Alan for a couple of days, but you know, this is his meeting, not mine, so I'll be very, very brief. And I have 5 ideas more or less thrown in at random, partly from Alan, then picking up from Silvio. The first thing is we have here a movement called citizen science, science for the people, whatever. And we then say, oh, sorry, can you hear me back there? Yeah. That's better. Okay, we have a movement, and we then think of other movements which are in response to an unsolved societal problem. Going back even to trade unions or women's rights or whatever. And of course, they're always evolving. They all have their own internal tensions and contradictions. They can all be corrupted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if we say, oh, well, now the time has become ripe, as it wasn't ripe 20 years ago, for a movement. And in this movement, you'll have everything from the ornithologists to the anti-pollution campaigners. Everything from people who want to help the real scientists solve their problems to people who say that science in the service of the state is corrupt and we have to fight it. They're all there, and what we can expect is as the thing grows and matures, these tensions will come out, the movement may split, but let's say that is our heuristic to say, okay, here we have a nascent movement. First point. Second point, I would say on a historical point, this is for post-normal science, and Silvio and I have observed this for a long time. Right early on, reflecting on Lois Gibbs and similar campaigns, we spoke of an extended peer community. And all sorts of commentators, including good friends of ours, read extended peer review. And I think it's fair to say that the full force of community is not conveyed by review. So we are talking about extended peer communities. Okay. Also, when we are talking about the origins of this movement, we also have to face something where the, quotes, science as an idea has to some extent been, I think the technical term is, mystified. We think of science as those good folks in white coats. My favorite thing, which I quote too many times, is a scientist is someone, white male, spectacles, white coat, holding up a test tube to the light and realizing he has discovered the cure for cancer. Now, typically a scientist is a worker. He's a proletarian in the knowledge industry, working on pre-assigned problems where his product of his labor is alienated from him, either totally because he's an employee or partially because he's a cottage worker or whatever. And he is now, or even she, is now an employee in one of the world's major industries, but on a job and frequently now on a very insecure, exploitative job. And so the social reality of mainstream science has itself been transformed, which then obviously will transform its relations with external oppositional movements. So as I say, when we say science or scientist, our thoughts should be to the proletarians in a new major industry rather than in those discoverers who are helping humanity. Okay. Now, obviously, this industry, major industry, is tied in with the state, as Alan has indicated and Silvio has indicated in various ways. And so citizen science at one end will have an essentially political character. And I remember I wasn't at San Diego, but I was at Muki Hakley's meeting in London, and there I met Heidi Ballard, professor at UC Davis, and her eyes were sparkling when she said, I can now see it happening where the maker movement in the States, which is like DIY, combining with the environmental justice movement, and then we're going to do things. See? Now, the ornithologist might find this embarrassing, but there is a new form of politicized science or scientized politics, which is interesting. Next, the last thing is about the scientific institutions. And I was quite delighted when I turned up this morning and went to Angela's office, and there on the wall, among various other interesting things, was a Xerox of a page that I recognized, and this is page 5 of Thomas Kuhn's book, Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And on that page, if you look, you will find a profound and prophetic statement, which I think has not been sufficiently appreciated, and that was normal science. And there Kuhn said, normal science, which, as he said, all scientists do most of the time, and most scientists do all the time, normal science is the strenuous and devoted attempt to force nature into the conceptual boxes provided by professional education. See? And you say, what? See? Now, this is what he perceived. And of course, it takes Popper out the window, Merton out the window. The scientist is a process worker who is moreover a brainwashed process worker. Now, to the extent that this characterization is correct, and of course there was no empirical evidence for this, it was Kuhn himself, if that characterizes the knowledge industry, then we understand why the workers in the knowledge industry find it difficult to appreciate citizen science. Final point, and this really I owe most to our colleague Andrea Sartelli, and that is, when we look at science, both in the production of knowledge and also as an instrument of the state through regulation and control, to say nothing of warfare, and finally in the realm of consciousness, where when we have a problem, we go to an expert. We don't go to a priest or imam or rabbi. We go to a psychologist or an ethicist or whatever. So science is now simultaneously a major instrument of state policy, not merely justification, but also implementation. It is also now a major industry on its own. Just recently, The Lancet had this editorial where it mentioned that biomedical research now runs at $1/3 trillion per year. Now that is a big industry. That's biomedical. That's public knowledge. So if you throw in the rest of public knowledge, we're talking about something coming up the heavy side of $500 billion. That is big business. That takes lots and lots of Kuhnian workers. Okay? And then on the government side, you have regulation, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I'll just advertise for Andrea's own material, and that is all three sectors are in crisis. The knowledge production sector has an open crisis of corruption of quality. The advisory section has an open crisis of the rejection by the public of various state-sponsored positions. And the consciousness has its own crises in the growth of alternative movements of the right and the left. And so citizen science now comes into that very exciting situation. And one can imagine, finally, citizen science filtering into the education system, where kids at school start doing projects. And science is then no longer a doctrine to be fed to them dogmatically, but it becomes an activity where there are mistakes, where there's disagreement, where there's open-endedness, and science then becomes quite a different sort of knowing. And in a sense, it then makes the challenge to the conception of science that Thomas Kuhn announced, and which is still there, implemented in all schools nearly, and even most university education too. So, as Alan said, the exciting thing about citizen science is not just where it's at, but where it's taking us. And thanks a lot.
Thank you.